Welcome to episode 24 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about in this episode at www.7-health.com/24. So that's www.7, so spelled out seven-health.com/24.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the show. This is another episode where I have a guest on. But before I launch into this, I just want to mention that I have reopened my practice to new clients. So I take on clients twice a year, once at the start of the year and once at the midpoint, and I'm doing that now. I work with clients for a period of 5 months where we do a consult for an hour every 2 weeks. And I have clients all over the world, and consults are done via Skype or FaceTime or phone if that works best for people. So even if you're not based in the UK, this isn't a problem. I mean, lots of clients are based elsewhere. More than half my clients are based in the US or Canada or Australia and places outside the UK. So before I work with anyone, I like to have a free initial chat, and it allows me to find out more about what they're wanting help with and what they want to get out of the process. And it gives me an opportunity to explain to them about how I work together and how the process works. So basically having that chat lets us see if we're the right fit for one another. And I only want to work with people who I truly believe that I can help and people who are on the same page as me. So this chat allows me to work out if this is the case. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can head over to www.7-health.com/help. So that's www.7, so seven-health.com/help. And if you go to that page, it'll bring up a page with all the details about how I work with clients, my costs and all of that. And it has on there a link that you can click so you can apply for that free chat. And I'll get back to you within 48 hours and we can arrange a time to have a chat to see if we're a good fit for one another. So if you're wanting to start 2016 with some help with your health or nutrition or body image or food issues, you can head over to www.seven-health.com/help. So today's guest is Melissa A. Fabello, and Melissa is a body acceptance and eating disorder activist. She's a scholar in the field of sexuality and a Jurassic Park enthusiast based in Philadelphia. Currently, Melissa works as the managing editor of Everyday Feminism, the largest independent feminist media website in the world, and is a doctoral candidate in Weddermere University Human Sexuality Studies program, where her research focuses on how women with anorexia nervosa experience skin hunger. So I've been following Melissa for about maybe 9 months, somewhere around that. I think I stumbled across a video of hers on YouTube. I then started to see that she was being referenced by certain people that I follow and that she was appearing on certain podcasts. I started reading more of her articles and started to follow Everyday Feminism and really liked what the site is about. And so I contacted her, invited her to come on the show. So we talk about her own history with food issues, different aspects of feminism, and also her current study on anorexia and skin hunger, which is really fascinating. So enjoy the show. So hi, Melissa. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
So I know you're a body acceptance activist, you're a sexuality scholar, and the managing editor of Everyday Feminism, and these are all things that I want to chat with you about today on the show. But to start off with, do you want to describe your background and how you got into this line of work?
Yeah, sure. It's sort of one of those things that things just happened. Like I didn't even try. I'm a very type A person. And so I'm real big on, or I have been in the past, really big on like 5-year plans. Like this is exactly what I'm going to do. And I would follow that road. No matter what distractions came along, I'd be like, no, I decided I'm doing X, Y, Z, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Which is both helpful and not helpful in life, I think. And so I was following this plan. I was after I graduated college, I was a high school English teacher for a while. And I had sort of this quarter life crisis where I realized that I was really not happy. And some of that had to do with just the environment that I was in, the work environment that I was in. But I realized I was like, this isn't working for me. I need to do something different in my life. And because I had the resources, I guess, I said, okay, so what that means for me is I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to move out of the country for a little while, and I'm going to figure out my life. And that's what I did. So in this process, I also, around this time, had started to get interested in feminism after I had a really, really unhealthy relationship with someone and then developed an eating disorder. I got into feminism. So it was kind of something in the back of my mind, and I had decided to go back to school for human sexuality studies, a master's program. So really kind of that, all of that was somewhat intentional, although I didn't realize, obviously, that in my early 20s, suddenly I was going to be like, I can't do this life anymore. I have to do something different. But while I was, I took a year off in between when I quit my teaching job and when I went back to school. I took a year off. And during that year off, I kind of came to the realization that the whole 5-year plan thing was actually putting pressure on myself rather than allowing myself to see what came along and to take what came as, not necessarily symbolic or like a sign, but like to just kind of go with the flow a little bit more. So I wanted to try that. And as that's happened, this is a very long-winded way to say that when I decided to start doing that, what happened was that a lot of opportunities fell in my lap. And so while I was definitely interested in feminism and obviously going to school is helpful for connections and things like that, kind of the world of like the online sphere of writing or making videos and social media, all of that just sort of happened because I let it happen. So yeah, I don't know. So it's always weird. People are like, how did you get to where you are? Or how did you? I'm like, I have no idea. It just, it just happened and I let it happen. So yeah.
And I mean, you mentioned that you've had some issues with food, and I work a lot with women in this area. So do you want to tell about your story and how that all came about and how you got over that?
Yeah, I think my story is not particularly interesting for the most part. And in that, I think it follows a pretty predictable like narrative. But I had actually a really healthy relationship with my body for a long time. This is the only kind of unique part of the story, was that for a long time in my life, I felt really good about my body. I have a pretty average sized or smaller sized body. So obviously fitting into society's ideals more or less is helpful with that. But, all through high school, I mean, sometimes I had bad days, but for the most part, I was happy. I was a competitive gymnast for a while, and even that, I was still, like, happy with my body.
Which is rare.
Yeah, right? Very rare, definitely. And then I went to college, and I was also just, like, still happy with my body. And then in college, as happens with a lot of people, I gained a lot of weight, like a lot. And I was still just like so happy. Like I was like, everything's good. I love food. Like I would go to like out to eat and we'd be like, you want dessert? People would be like, you want a split? Like, no. I was just like, so why would we split it? What's the point of that? So I was just really happy. And again, obviously there were bad days and days when I was upset, but for the most part, I felt good. And then I got into this really bad relationship where the person that I was dating had definitely his own body image issues. And he was this kind of person who, he spent like 4 hours a day in the gym. I don't know if I would say that he necessarily had like an over-exercising like compulsion, but just was really into fitness. And every once in a while I feel like kind of project that onto me. Like one time asked me, do you think you look good naked? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, really? Like, ouch. Which is such a ridiculous, yeah, like, you have sex with me, like, and like, that's a weird thing to say, right? And I was like, well, yeah. And he would say things like, oh, you'd have a nice body if you just went to the gym a little bit. Like, just these tiny little comments here and there. And then eventually we broke up, and he broke up with me. And he kind of part of the reasoning why he wanted to break up partly was because he was dating multiple other women at the same time, which I didn't know. But one of these women actually had recently gotten into the gym. Like, she recently was, like, really into the gym. So while partly I think, that was a interest thing. Like, Melissa doesn't like going to the gym, but this woman does. I also think that I don't know, kind of said something to me implicitly around body types. And I knew that I wasn't going to see him. We worked together. And I knew that I wasn't going to see him for 3 months because we had this chunk of time off. So at that point I said, well, I'll show him. And I went on a diet. And that diet obviously spiraled out of control, which again is very typical storyline. But that, and yeah, I mean that's kind of the how it developed part. And then eventually, and obviously I lost a chunk of weight in a short period of time. And one of my friends finally, I had friends and family kind of be like, "Are you all right? Like, are you doing okay?" But no one really said anything. It was like too easy to like wave away. Like they'd be like, "Are you all right?" Like, "Yeah, it's fine." Okay. That was kind of it. And finally I had a friend who told me, he said, "I think you have a problem." And I was like, "No, I don't." And I got so angry. And then I kind of realized, wow, if I'm this angry that someone would suggest that I have a problem, like maybe I do have a problem. And so I kind of thought about it for a few months. I percolated on it. And then I said, let me call my doctor. Let me see what my doctor says. So, and that's hard, right? So part of the thing that's interesting is my eating disorder developed in adulthood, which is not as common. And it's a lot harder, I think, to get help for an eating disorder when no one's making you. Yeah. I think it always has to be something that you're doing, right? That it's your decision that you want help. Like, no one's ever going to actually find help if they're being forced into help. But also, it wasn't like I had parents who were like, you need to go to the doctor. Like, it was all on me. And that's hard. So I think I eventually came to the place where, okay, I'll make a doctor's appointment. And while I was on hold with the doctor's office, I thought, well, let me just lose X more amount of pounds, and then I'll go to the doctor. Like, I was like, let me hang up. And then I was like, no, Melissa, you clearly know. Like, there's obviously a problem. Like, stay on the line. And I did, and I eventually went to the doctor. And I really lucked out because a lot of doctors can really say all the wrong things, and mine said all the right things. I explained why I was there, what I was experiencing, and she said, "Okay, well, it sounds like you have an eating disorder, and here are your options." And she offered me, I could do therapy, I could go to a nutritionist, I could do medication. I decided at the time what was best for me was to try medication and a nutritionist. I didn't feel like therapy, like group therapy, was going to be useful. Like, I don't ever really, well, I know for me, I don't really know that group therapy around eating disorders would be helpful because I feel like I would just compare myself to everyone in the room all the time, and that would be unhealthy for me. So I don't know why I didn't consider individual therapy. But anyways, the point being that I decided to do the medication and the nutritionist, and that all really, really helped. Well, the nutritionist didn't help very much, but the medication did, and kind of got me out of my obsessive thoughts. And it could have just been placebo. Like, maybe secretly deep down inside I really wanted to change, and I just needed a way to, like, an avenue to do so, but I don't know. But it did definitely have a big effect on me. And that was kind of it. Obviously, recovery isn't magical like that. It's not like, okay, it's over, yay, and it's never a problem again. It comes up and back and forth for years. But that was the thick of it. That was, the worst of it, and how I eventually came to a place where I wanted to get better and started to get better.
And so how long, for everyone is going to be different, but for you, how long did recovery take to get to a place where you're like, I'm feeling much better about things and this isn't having such a big bearing on my life?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think probably definitely struggled in the first year. It's funny because, well, it's not funny, but the eating disorder itself was very, very short-lived. And so not that makes it any more or less serious or more and less important or whatever, but it definitely was very short-lived. And so the recovery process has been exponentially longer, which is actually like very frustrating. But it I think, I struggled a lot the first year, and then I would say felt really good for a couple of years after that, maybe 2 years after that, and then kind of fell back into a diet that was anybody looking at it in our culture would say that it was just a diet and it was fine. But I think that our culture, first of all, has really mixed up ideas around what's healthy and what's not around food. And I also think that for a person with an eating disorder past, any kind of diet probably isn't a good idea.
No, it just makes it too likely that you're going to slip into old habits.
Exactly. It's too easy. Yeah, it's too easy. I think what had happened was I went through weight restoration and, I gained extra, which is normal. But then I started doing this thing where I would try to defy the eating disorder. So let's say I wanted to order pizza, and then the eating disorder in my brain would be like, you're not going to order pizza. You can't eat pizza. And then I'd be like, no, fuck you. I am going to eat pizza. But then I'd eat the whole pizza. So then I was like, what am I doing? Like, that's not good either. Like, what? I mean, of course, if you want to eat a whole pizza every once in a while, go for it. But like consistently having this battle where to prove that I didn't have, that I wasn't restricting, I would overeat. And I was like, why am I doing this? And that's kind of where the idea came from. Like, I'll go on a diet. But, and then that was years, up until very recently that I was still kind of in the hold of this diet that definitely wasn't like the hell that the full-blown eating disorder was, but was still hard because it takes over your whole brain all the time. So I think had I not done that and just worked on myself and my confidence and my happiness, then that actually would have made it so that recovery had happened quicker. I also think recovery just isn't something that ends. I think it's kind of a constant thing that you're doing with yourself. But I would say actually the other day I had the first moment, which is like, this is a long period of time, right? But the other day I had an experience for the first time when someone said something about eating. A friend of mine was saying that she hadn't eaten breakfast. She forgot, I guess, to eat breakfast. And when she realized that she hadn't eaten, like most people would go, oh, I haven't eaten, let me eat something. But she said that when she realized it, she got frustrated with herself, that she was sad that she had to eat. Because kind of in her head, she was like, oh, well, I already forgot to eat. I could just not eat all day, right? So she was telling me, oh, I feel like sad now because I have to eat. And my first immediate reaction was, that makes no sense. I was like, what are you talking about? And then I was really surprised at myself because I was like, no, I do know exactly what she's talking about. And I'm surprised that it wasn't my first reaction to like empathize or sympathize or to be like, oh yeah, totally, I know that feeling or whatever. But it was actually like confusion. And that was the first time that I was like, wow, like my brain is getting better. Because I think it's your body gets better and you can start, I think, at first in recovery to control your habits a little better and your behavior. But the thoughts still creep up. And I think the thoughts come up and you have to actively say, no, thought, I'm not going to listen to you. And that is a big part of recovery. But, I kind of had for that moment that the thought didn't even show up, and I was surprised. But I think it's a different process for everybody. And I think that it's also something that we have to be a little bit more compassionate with ourselves around that. Things come and go. If we're in a stressful place in our life, sometimes these things come back. And instead of feeling down on ourselves, like, I'm supposed to be recovered, I think that we just have to understand that recovery is complicated and that's all right. And as long as we're trying, I think is the good thing. I think that's important.
And I mean, it's more likely it's going to come up during times of stress because it is a coping mechanism.
Right, absolutely.
And so it's not like, oh, I'm now failing because it's come up again. It's like, okay, let's reflect on what's going on in my life and why this is now happening again, as opposed to feeling like a failure.
Right, exactly. That's exactly, how that goes. And it's hard. The coping mechanism thing is hard because it's basically like the first thing I ever think of. That's the first thing that I ever think of, basically, when I'm having a hard time or I'm stressed out or I'm sad or whatever, is the first thing that comes to mind. It's like, oh, well, I don't have to eat. And that's so easy. Like, it feels so easy. So, like, having to develop in recovery other coping mechanisms, other skills has been really, really helpful also. Just, like, realizing that there are other ways to feel good and figuring out what those things are and doing those things instead. can actually be tremendously helpful.
Yeah, well, I think it's almost impossible to get to a place of being recovered if you don't have those other methods.
Right, yeah. That's why self-care is so necessary. People kind of scoff at it, but it's like you have to be able to take care of yourself and have ways to both prevent and intervene in your stress and anxiety so that you don't kind of lose that control again.
And I'm always with so many experiences in life where there have been negative experiences trying to find a silver lining. And I imagine there's been some benefits or some good things that have come out of the fact that you have had an eating disorder and then recovered. I mean, are there stuff that you can think of, like, if I hadn't gone through this, I wouldn't know about that, or I wouldn't be able to do this, those kind of things?
Yeah, it's such a weird thing because I feel like I would never that time in my life was so dark and so awful. And if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't. I don't know what my life would be like now because my life right now is so centered on eating disorder stuff. And yeah, maybe I would have become interested in it at some point, maybe. But I think I probably would have ended up doing something really different with my life. So it's definitely, I don't know. So in that way, it's really interesting. I wouldn't say I'm thankful for it, but it definitely has basically given me a career. So weirdly enough. But I also think, when it comes to, say, feminism, for example, which is such an important aspect of my life, I think that, and just a very powerful thing in my life, I should say, I discovered feminism not really necessarily in relationship to the eating disorder, but that feminism really helped me deal with the eating disorder, I think, and understand where the eating disorder came from. And I don't know that I would have been as maybe interested in feminism or as attached to feminism had I not had this very clear thing that I had just been going through that feminism was answering.
So how did that start about then? How did you get into the feminism thing, or it became more important at that stage in your life?
It's so weird. It's one of those things, again, just fell in my lap. A friend of mine, so it was two things kind of happened in very quick succession, which is that one friend of mine had learned about this relationship that I had been in, this very emotionally abusive relationship that I had been in, and she gave me a book. And to be honest with you, I don't even know what the book was called. It's something about smart women, something, I don't even know, something like that. Things smart women know. It's something like that, which I actually think is a terrible title, but but whatever. But it was basically about this is how a relationship should look. And it was basically this really helpful, it's a self-help book. And it was very helpful. Way to look at this is what a relationship should look like if XYZ is happening in your relationship. That's not a healthy relationship. And it helped me understand, reading that book, I was oh, it's not my fault what happened in this relationship. That wasn't because of me. I didn't do anything wrong. And so she gave me that book. And while I don't think it was necessarily outwardly or explicitly feminist, it obviously had a lot of feminist theory behind it. Around the same time, I would say within weeks, around the same time, one of my closest friends sent me the book Cunt by Igna Muschio. And Cunt is a very, very intense book. I mean, it's very feminist and very radical also. So, and I read this. So I had these two experiences where I read this really very explicitly feminist book, and then I read this other book that was a little bit more grounded, but also had feminist theory behind it. And I was oh, feminism. This is interesting. And so then I went to the bookstore and I got a couple more books. And then as I was reading more and more about women's issues, I think more I was oh, women's issues was kind of where I was coming from. And then I started to creep toward the F word. And then as I was reading more about feminism, then I was oh, everything that's ever happened in my life, basically, every major thing in my life that's been horrible, this is the answer. This is why it happened. This explains to me why everything about being a woman sucks, right? And then as I started to explore more intersectional feminism, then it was oh, this is why everything in the world is the way that it is. Like everything that I've ever seen in life that is horrible is also answered by this, kind of this theory or this idea, this concept.
And for anyone who doesn't know what intersectional feminism is, can you explain that term and what it means?
Yeah, so basically when people think about feminism, they think of feminism as a movement toward gender equality or gender justice, right? Which is for sure what it is at its core. Intersectional feminism, so intersectionality is an idea that many women of color, particularly Black women, have talked about for a long time. So Audre Lorde had talked about it. Patricia Hill Collins had talked about it in different ways. And then Kimberly Crenshaw, I want to say in 1989, actually coined the term intersectionality. And basically what the idea is that we all have different parts of our identities, and those identities meet and they affect one another, and they're not really inseparable. So what had happened was, when you look at kind of the 60s and 70s, that kind of time frame in American history, that we had the second wave feminist movement, which was focused mostly on white middle-class women happening. And we also had the civil rights movement happening, which was mostly focused on Black men. So then Black women said, well, where's the space for us? Because we don't actually fit into either of these movements, because they're not actually for us. And so Black women started talking about, and other women of color started talking about how their race and their gender, for example, you can't separate. That being a Black woman is different from being a Black man and different from being a white woman. That's a special intersection of identities. So intersectional feminism takes into account that we all have identities, and they all matter, and they all play a role, so that and that they have to be taken into account always. Or else what happens is, when we think about women, what we really do is we think about white women. We create white, middle class, educated, straight, cisgender women as the default. And that's why that can be really dangerous, because it just creates a space where that's the only womanhood that we consider, and that doesn't actually help all women. So yeah, that's kind of the short answer of what intersectional feminism is.
Okay, cool. So sorry, I think you were talking more about feminism more broadly and how you got into it. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's fine. And I mean, that was basically it, was that it really just helped me realize how the world worked. It gave me a framework. This is kind of the best way to explain it. Feminism, and especially intersectional feminism, gives me and gives other people a framework to understand the way that the world works. It's this is what's happening. These are the structures and the institutions that are in place. This is how it affects people broadly, and this is how it affects people on a day-to-day, face-to-face interaction level. And it just helped me understand, when I was 11 years old and grown men were saying sexual things to me on the street, which, is something that still happens, that now I understand why that was happening. Or when I was having sex with a man and I told him to stop and he didn't stop and I felt real bad about it, but I couldn't figure out why, this explains why that happened. Or when I got into a really unhealthy relationship and I felt really bad about myself, this explains why this happened. When I developed an eating disorder and I hated my body, now I understand where that came from. So it just kind of really gives a framework for our personal experiences, but also just more broadly, globally, why things happen the way that they happen, and why certain groups of people have power and certain groups of people do not, and how that affects people and disenfranchises people. And yeah, I don't know. So honestly, sometimes I joke that feminism's like a born again religion for me. As soon as I found it, I was like, this is the word. And I had to spread it and tell everybody about it, because it was so life changing and eye opening and enlightening for me.
Wow. Okay. And for me, it's something I'm just getting into more of and starting to read more about. And definitely, I mean, you're your editor at Everyday Feminism, or managing editor at Everyday Feminism, and it's a site that I'm reading much more of. And it does feel like it's so important to understand how that fits into disordered eating and eating disorders. Mm-hmm. That you don't really have one without the other, or at least not to the same scope that we have it today.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of theories on that, which, you can take or leave. But there's definitely, some people have this idea, exactly what you're saying, that in a patriarchal society or a society that's ruled by men, and that isn't to say that men don't have problems or that men don't struggle or that life is easy for men, but when we live in a society where men are given more resources and access to power, that in any situation where one group gets more access and resources to power, that means that other groups are getting fewer access and resources to power. So if men, and particularly straight cisgender men and white middle class, etc., men are the ones who have more power, then anybody who doesn't fit into that is getting less and less power. And so there are some people who say that within a patriarchal society, eating disorders might be inevitable. So I would say that may or may not be true, but I would say that definitely in a patriarchal society where we expect women to be invisible, where we want women to be silent, and we want women to take up as least space as possible, then particularly eating disorders in their like restrictive forms are likely for sure, because everything about being a woman is about being small and about even just our ideas about femininity being something that's like delicate and fragile, is about being small. Or even when I think about, there's this concept called manspreading, which is basically that when a man sits somewhere like on a subway or whatever, that he like spreads his legs and takes up like all this space, where women will like cross their legs and take up as little space as possible. And people are like, that is ridiculous. Like, of all the things to worry about, you're worried about that. It's one of those like things that's like a symptom of a much larger problem, right? Where, okay, like I get it that like some men who have penises have stuff in the way that like they can't maybe take up as little space, but it's like, listen, like it is not that big, bro. Like, you do not need to take up that much. You're like taking up like 3 seats. Like, that's so unnecessary. You don't have to do that. But that like women can't do that, right? So I was on a plane the other day, and the guy sitting next to me was like in my space. Like one of his legs was partly in my, like where my feet were supposed to go. And I was just like, are you kidding me? I almost said something, but I didn't. But so then of course I had to take up less space so that he could have more space. And then I was getting really mad about it. But that, I think when you combine those two things, that like men have power and we want women to be as small as possible, that eating disorders are possible, or the thin ideal at least is possible, which creates diets being possible, which then I think is where a lot of eating disorders come from. I also think that I was going to say something really smart, but I have no idea what it was. It doesn't ask me. Maybe it wasn't smart, and I'm glad I forgot it. Who knows?
But and I remember you recommended a book on one of your videos, or it might have been a post about A Hunger So Wide and Deep, which is then looking at eating disorders much more broadly out of that. That doesn't follow the normal white middle-class female trying to be thin, and looks at how eating disorders can be then affecting people of all different colours and genders, and how it's used in those different situations.
Right, and I think so. I also think that the body is a very, very easy kind of target for oppression. I think that the body is a site of oppression very frequently, which is why something like, even when you think about street harassment or catcalling, which I think is too nice of a term for what it is, when you have people shouting at you on the street, that is something that happens to women, but it's also something that happens to trans and gender non-conforming people. It's something that happens to queer people. It's something that happens to people where you believe that you can read something on their body that makes you not like them. And so I think that the body is a very common site for oppression. And when you look at, for example, like I was just saying about patriarchal society and wanting women to be smaller, but also in a white supremacist society, we want people of color to be more silent and to be smaller. In a heterocentric culture, we want queer people to be smaller and to take up less space also. So all of these different systems of power want all of these different marginalized groups to have less space. And so I think the more marginalized you are, like the more intersecting identities you have that are oppressed, then it's potentially more likely that you would have an eating disorder, because your body is constantly under scrutiny and constantly really just constantly being oppressed. Like, your body is always wrong. And when you have beauty standards, right? We have beauty standards. We talk a lot about the thin ideal as a beauty standard, and that's real, and we have to talk about that because it's very important. But also whiteness is a beauty ideal. And we don't talk about that as much. Or femininity, the kind of what we would call like a heterocentric idea of femininity, like a femininity that is attractive to men, is also a beauty ideal. So we have all these beauty ideals that actually represent all different kinds of power and oppression relationships, so that people who don't, the less you fit into the box, I think the more likely you are to hate your body, because you don't have images of your body being celebrated and treated with respect in the world.
And do you, from your opinion, do you think that this is getting better or it's getting worse? Because from where I am, because I'm starting to follow more people within this arena, it feels like there's more of a voice and things are going in the right direction, even if it is slowly. But I don't know if that's just because that's where my awareness is.
Yeah, I think that's always hard to tell, because I get into my like feminist body acceptance like bubble, and then I go out in the world and I hear like everyday people talk, and I'm like, oh damn, like we have a lot of work to do. Like, I'll be feeling real good about things, and then I hear, even like out, like we just had Thanksgiving in the US, and like even just going home for that, and my own family's saying things where I'm like, oh god, but no, it's my own family, make it stop. So I think it's getting better. I don't know what that really means, though, like how to really quantify that, but I think it's getting better in that more people are understanding that it's an issue, like that more people have even just the language to talk about this stuff. And I think that in and of itself is helpful. I think that just people kind of realizing that stuff, I think, makes a really big difference. And when just people recognize that, or even feminism, for example, and feminism ties into a lot of this stuff, but I feel like feminism is kind of trendy right now, and that's for better or for worse. But I do think it's kind of like this trendy thing that we're talking about, and that's kind of cool, which, again, there's some things about that are bad, but just the fact that more people are being exposed to it means that it's more likely for people to fall into it also. So I definitely think things are getting somewhat better. I think people are making noise, and I think that it's maybe not necessarily that people are starting to listen, but that more people are making more noise, if that makes sense. And I think that that's when change starts to happen, when it reaches kind of that crescendo of voice, I think, is when change starts to spill over into change, because there's nowhere else for it to go. So I think maybe it's getting better. I hope so.
Okay. Cool. And I know you've talked about body positivity, and it's something you're really behind. But again, it can be a little bit one-dimensional and not very accepting of different body shapes apart from white, female, that kind of thing. I mean, how do you see that movement can be improved?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is, I think that we think about it wrong. I think that we tend to think about this idea of like inclusion. Like, we think, let's include more people in our movement. I'm not saying that in and of itself is a bad thing. It definitely comes from the right place. But there's this idea of like, here I am, like, say for me, a white woman, sitting at this table, and this metaphorical table, and I can invite people to my table. Like, I can say, okay, I want more people of color, more queer and trans people, etc. at my table. And then I can say, tell me your ideas, tell me your thoughts, how can I be better, whatever. And then I, try to take that information back to my people, right? The problem is that I'm still the one with the control. I'm still the one with the power. I am still the one who is being heard. And that's not really actually helpful to those other people. So one thing I think is that we need to have more marginalized people in positions of power in the movement. Like, more marginalized people leading the movement, rather than the same group of people, mostly white women, in charge. So I think that that's one thing. But the other thing I think too is that we also have to realize that those other movements are already happening. that like there are trans specific anti-eating disorder like movements happening. There are people of color, when there are fat people, and there are all these different groups of people already have their movements. And I think that people who are already in charge, people who already have the power, think, how can I include them in my movement, rather than saying, how can I just be more cognizant of these other movements that are happening, and how can I make my movement better based on what I'm learning from these other spaces. So I think that for people who are interested in body acceptance and doing work like that, I think something that's really important is honestly just following the right people. Like, and by following, I mean both like following on social media, but also following the lead of people who are doing really important work. And if you're someone who has a platform, then spending a little bit more time amplifying those voices rather than throwing your own voice out there. And that's something that I have to work on a lot. I'm actually in the process, in the middle of a social media break, and part of that was because I really wanted to sit down and think through how my activism was helpful and how it was actually harmful. And there are a lot of ways that it's harmful because I take up space. I take up resources, just by, writing on something that someone else could write about, or being even like a guest on a podcast, or like on TV, or like on wherever where someone else could have done that. But I'm taking up that space and that resource. So I've been thinking a lot about, just for myself, like how can I be better about guiding people toward other people who are doing this work, rather than always talking about myself, in my experience and the experience of people who look like me. So I think it's a lot about when we want to do better. I think sometimes we just mix up what that looks like. And I think what it actually looks like is recognizing that it's not our business really to try to speak for another movement, but rather to let that movement speak for itself.
Okay, I mean, that's really well said, and it makes me think that even with the stuff that I regularly share and I put out, it is very, very narrow, and being more open and finding all of those other sources that you talk about, and starting to share more of that stuff is a really good suggestion.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, that's one way that I think is definitely something that's helpful. It's just following the people who are doing that work and just kind of promoting what they're doing can be a good step.
So you are a sexuality scholar. How did you find your way into that? I know you talked about it very briefly at the start, but what was the impetus for getting into that line of work?
Yeah, sexuality was always something that was interesting to me. I think that I had a friend in college who had said something one time about how we all are interested in something that we ourselves struggle with, and that we study things that we want to help kind of solve for ourselves, which I think can be accurate. I think sexuality is something that was always complicated for myself growing up, and I found I just found myself really interested in both sexuality as a more like kind of theoretical concept, but also sexuality, just like sex itself, I found interesting. I think we all, to some extent, find sex interesting because it's around us all the time, but nobody tells us anything about it. So we're all kind of like, what is this thing and what's it about and whatever. So I think sex is a really interesting topic. I think most people think sex is an interesting topic, whether they want to say so or not. And I think a lot of people try to act like they don't think it's interesting, which is weird. But so I was always sort of interested. And then I noticed when I was doing my undergrad that I was an English major, English education. But I would find myself writing about gender and sexuality within the context of like the novels I was reading, for example. And so I realized that, okay, I'm clearly really interested in this. And I also, whenever I had to take an elective, I tried to take like a social elective. Like I tried to do sociology, anthropology, things like that. So I realized that I was just really interested in the way the world worked, and specifically around gender and sexuality. And there's actually there's another one now, but at the time when I was applying, there was only one sexuality program in the United States. One sexuality graduate program, specifically sexuality. Because a lot of places will have like women's gender and sexuality studies where they kind of like try to include it all. But like specifically sex, there was only one. And I kind of at the time was thinking I wanted to just be like a straight up sex educator because I love education. I love teaching. I love having like kids in my life and like students in my life. So I thought that I was just going to take a career change that was like, okay, I used to teach English. Now I teach like sex ed. That's not exactly what happened. I have taught sex ed, but that's not really like kind of where I ended up going. But yeah, I just always thought that sex is such a complicated thing. It's so complex, and people don't realize how complex it is because the average person, when they think sex, they just think of the act of sex. But there's so much more to sexuality. There's so much that happens in our lives that affects the way that we see ourselves and other people as sexual. That is just fascinating to me. And I also just think so important because it's something, like I said, that we all care about to some extent. And yet something that not many of us get an opportunity to explore. And I wish that more people kind of got that opportunity. So kind of being in a field like that allows me to give people more space to talk about and to explore their own sexual selves.
And that background, has that helped you with your work with Everyday Feminism?
Yeah, I think so. Because, I mean, it's a large topic. So it also involves stuff like dating, relationships. It's sexual assault and sexual violence, dating violence. I mean, there's so many things that it encompasses when you talk about sexuality that, yeah, I definitely think so. I also think so at this point I have a master's degree in education. And I also think Everyday Feminism is a very educational platform. Like, we really try to like help people understand things. There's two of us, two editors. We have two editors, and we're both educators by trade. So I think that that's actually a very special thing about Everyday Feminism is that it has people with expertise in education kind of running the online magazine, and that we feel really strongly that what we're trying to do is help people understand something and give them tools, really practical tools, to then take that information and do something with it. So I definitely think that it's been helpful in a lot of ways.
And I mean, when I read articles on Everyday Feminism, it's very different to a lot of other sites in terms of they're really detailed, longer articles, well-researched, lots of links to different things. And it feels like there's a lot of thought that goes into every one of the articles.
Yeah, too much thought maybe. No, I think, right? So most places, most online publications, what happens is you send them an email, you say, hello, I want to write an article on blah. And you send them like a paragraph of a pitch, right? And then they say yes or no. And then you send them the article, and if they like it, they publish it. If they don't like it, they don't. And they kind of copy edit it. Or they might send it back with a few like, hey, change this, this, and that. But we go through a really intense process. Like, I think anyone who writes for us is like, they're like a saint. They have a lot of patience because we go through a really long process where they have to really outline for us exactly what they're trying to say. And then we give them a lot of advice on how to craft it. And then they give us a draft, and we go back and forth and back and forth. We give our writers a month to write an article where most people will give you like a day, because we really want to like have a hand as editors in like what we end up producing, because there's something very specific that we're trying to do. So I'm glad that it's different from what other sites are doing, because I think a lot of writing is out there that's awesome. But I do like that. So I'm not trying to say that Everyday Feminism is better, but I think that it's unique. And I think that that's important, because I think that needs to exist. That kind of, not just here's what's wrong with the world, but here's what's wrong with the world. And now what are we going to do? So I do like it a lot.
And so with I know we talked about the sexuality, you're now doing a PhD, if I'm correct, researching anorexia nervosa and skin hunger.
Yes.
So do you want to describe what this is and maybe what you found out as part of doing this research? I know you're still in the process, but tell us more.
Yeah. So skin hunger, basically. So when you think about sex, you think about the extent to which you want to have sex, we call sex drive, right? And people are familiar with that. They understand that like people have a sex drive. People have different sex drives within a relationship. For example, you and your partners, if your sex drive is really mismatched, sometimes that can cause problems. Like, we understand that. We have like a general understanding about that. Skin hunger is similar, but it's about our sensual experiences rather than sexual. So it's about the extent to which we want to be hugged, cuddled, holding hands, sleeping with another person, like sleeping in bed, not having sex. So it's basically what sex drive is to sexuality, skin hunger is to sensuality. And there's a lot of research out there that says that women with anorexia nervosa, or women who have had anorexia nervosa, tend to have lower sex drives. And there are a lot of factors that play into that. For example, many women who are anorexic develop anorexia during their sexual development, so like between like puberty and adolescence, which is also the time, you know, like I said, when we're going through our sexual development. So it can kind of just like hinder a lot of things, both biologically and psychologically.
Yeah.
It also has to do with a lot of women who are anorexic also have specific like personality pathology around like perfectionism, immaturity, control, things like that. Things that like sex is something that you don't really have a lot of control over. I mean, you have control over whether or not you should have control over whether or not you're engaging in sex, but like your body does all sorts of things during sex like you didn't really have any control over. So it can be just something that's uncomfortable. Body image, obviously, women with anorexia have high incidence of body image disturbance, and body image plays a large role in sex because if you're not happy with your body, you don't want someone to look at it, touch it, explore it, and whatever, and that can be hard. So there's all these reasons why that might be. But no one has really looked directly at whether or not it also affects how women with anorexia experience skin hunger. So I've talked to some researchers who have said, you know, I think that most women, if not all women with eating disorders, have insecure attachment issues, which affects the way that they relate to other people, particularly romantic or sexual partners, and so therefore they don't want to be touched at all. Some other research that I've read has said that while women with anorexia do not generally want to have sex, they do want to be protected physically or touched physically in more sensual ways. So basically, any research that does exist out there is split. And I don't think anyone, not that I have found, that no one's actually looked specifically at it. That even a lot of the research that I've read is under like intimacy, which is kind of a more general idea than skin hunger. So I'm really curious to find out whether or not, just kind of what that relationship is. And why that might be, like how it compares to women's relationship with their sex drive, like, but just in general, like what women with anorexia's experiences with sensuality are, what their experiences with skin hunger are. That's the short version. But I haven't actually started I'm in the process now of designing the study, so I won't actually be collecting data until next year sometime. So I don't actually have like anything interesting to say about it yet because I don't know the answer, but those are the reasons behind why I'm looking at it.
Wow. I mean, that sounds fascinating.
Thanks. I hope I feel that way because I'm stuck with it for a while.
And how long is it likely before you do the study, and then how long will the study go on for? And I know these are questions you probably can't answer 100% because you just don't know, but in an ideal world. Well, in an ideal world, that'd be done already. No, I'm just kidding. I do have to create a timeline to try to follow. So my hope is that my study is approved by the spring, that my university gives me permission to do it, so that then I can start collecting data over the summer, so that then I can analyze the data in the fall. That's my hope. So we'll see what happens. Okay. Well, I mean, I really look forward to reading that when it's done because it sounds like something really super interesting.
Yeah, hopefully something interesting comes out of it. I feel like no matter what the answer is, whatever the answer ends up being, I think will be interesting and will add to a body of literature that currently doesn't cover it.
Cool. So, look, we're nearly out of time, but for people who want to find out more details about you, where should they be going?
To my mom. No, I'm just kidding. I think my website, melissafabello.com, is always there. It has all my social media links. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, YouTube, Instagram. Right now, probably until the end of the year, I think I'm on a social media break, but except for Instagram, I'm still using. And there's also a contact form on the website. There's also links to writing that I've done, videos that I've made. So that's probably the best place to find everything in one place.
Okay, well, perfect. Well, I will link to all of those different things in the show notes. We're recording this in December. This isn't going to be live until sometime in January. I don't know when it's going out. So you'll be hopefully finished your social media embargo and people can contact you that way. So, look, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been such an incredible chat having you here, and I've learned a lot from today's show.
Oh, well, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.